Sometime in late 1971, the exact date is still classified, an NSA analyst at Fort Meade sat down with a transcript that made no sense. Soviet Pacific Fleet admirals were talking to each other about submarine deployments, patrol schedules, readiness gaps. Not in coded language, not through secure channels designed to resist interception. They were speaking plainly, casually, the way a man talks when he is absolutely certain nobody else is in the room. The analyst flagged it. Had to. Because this kind of material didn't come from signals intelligence as anyone at Fort Meade understood it. SIGINT meant intercepting radio transmissions, cracking ciphers, pulling fragments out of the electromagnetic spectrum, and assembling them into something useful. What landed on this analyst's desk wasn't fragments. It was whole conversations, complete, unguarded. Soviet flag officers discussing operational vulnerabilities with the comfort of men sitting in their own kitchens. So, where was it coming from? That question, and the fact that almost nobody at Fort Meade was allowed to know the answer, defined one of the most closely held intelligence operations of the entire Cold War. If you find this kind of story as fascinating as I do, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment about what Cold War operation you think deserves its own deep dive. It helps this channel keep digging into the records that matter. The transcripts carried no source designation that matched any known collection program. The routing was unusual. The classification was stratospheric, compartmented beyond top secret, restricted to a handful of individuals across the entire intelligence community. Whatever was generating this material, the people protecting it had built walls around it that even senior NSA officials couldn't see past. And the material kept arriving. Week after week, month after month, the picture of Soviet Pacific Fleet operations grew sharper. Maintenance problems on specific submarine classes, personality clashes between commanders, training deficiencies that Moscow didn't want acknowledged. The kind of intelligence that could force war planners to throw out their old assumptions and start over. American war planners were reading the Soviet Navy's mail, and the Soviets had no idea. The analyst at Fort Meade processed the transcripts and moved on to the next batch. That was the job. But the operation feeding those transcripts involved American submarines, Navy divers in saturation gear, and a cable sitting on the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk that the Soviet Union believed was untouchable. The program was called Ivy Bells. The Soviets didn't know it existed for almost a decade. The sound inside a diesel submarine at depth is something veterans describe in terms that have nothing to do with engines. A low hum that lives in the bones. A pressure behind the teeth. The USS Cochino carried that sound into the Barents Sea in August of 1949 on what was officially a training cruise and was officially nothing of the sort. Cochino was hunting Soviet radar signals off the coast of Murmansk, one of the first American submarine espionage missions of the Cold War, and she caught fire, suffered a battery explosion, and sank. One sailor from Cochino and 6 from the rescue submarine Tusk died in freezing water. The disaster nearly killed American submarine espionage before it started. It didn't. The Navy looked at the losses, looked at the intelligence gaps, and decided the risk was worth paying. Within 2 years, specially modified boats were running penetration missions into Soviet territorial waters so routinely that the operations had their own bureaucratic infrastructure. Dedicated briefing protocols, cover stories layered 3 deep crew members who couldn't tell their wives which ocean they'd been sailing in. The program was called Holystone, and by the late 1950s, it had become one of the most productive intelligence pipelines in the American arsenal. Submarines tracked Soviet missile tests. They recorded propeller signatures that could identify individual warships by sound alone. They mapped Soviet harbor defenses from distances that would have caused an international crisis if anyone had known. Why did this work so well? 2 reasons. American nuclear submarines were quieter than anything the Soviets could build or detect. And the ocean is enormous. A submarine running silent in deep water is functionally invisible. The Soviets knew American boats were out there somewhere. They just couldn't find them. Meanwhile, the Soviet Pacific Fleet had a problem that looked like an advantage. The Sea of Okhotsk a vast, frigid body of water bordered by Kamchatka to the east and Siberia to the west, functioned as a protected bastion for Soviet ballistic missile submarines. Geography made it a natural fortress. The Kuril Island chain created a barrier of shallow straits that Soviet surface ships and aircraft could monitor. Any American submarine trying to enter Okhotsk would have to thread through those choke points under heavy surveillance. So, the Soviets felt safe there. Safe enough to run hardwired military communication cables across the seafloor, connecting their naval installations. Petropavlovsk on Kamchatka to Vladivostok on the mainland. Cable communication had one overwhelming advantage over radio. It couldn't be intercepted by antenna farms or satellites or aircraft bristling with electronic warfare equipment. Signals traveling through a physical wire stayed in that wire. The laws of physics guaranteed it. A message sent through an undersea cable was, for all practical purposes, unbreachable. The assumption held for every year of the Cold War up to 1971. The idea to tap those cables came from a Navy captain named James Bradley, and the origin story has a quality that sounds too neat to be true. Bradley supposedly remembered seeing signs along the Mississippi River as a kid, signs warning boaters not to anchor near underwater cables. If the Soviets were running cables across the Sea of Okhotsk, there would be similar markers on the shoreline. Warnings for Soviet fishermen, indicators that told you exactly where the cables were if you knew what to look for. I've seen this anecdote in at least 4 different sources, and none of them agree on exactly when Bradley had this insight. One places it in 1969. Another says early 1970. The Naval Institute's account is vague on the timeline. What matters is that Bradley took the idea up the chain, and the people above him recognized what it could mean. If an American submarine could reach those cables undetected, and if divers could physically attach a recording device to the line without cutting it, the United States would have access to raw Soviet military communications that the Soviets believed were impossible to intercept. The physics said it couldn't be done. Electromagnetic induction said otherwise. A cable carrying electrical signals produces a faint magnetic field around itself. Wrap a sensor around that cable, and the field becomes readable. The concept was operational within months. Almost nothing in Cold War intelligence history moved that fast. Bell Laboratories got the contract, and the engineers who received the specifications had questions that nobody would answer. The device needed to clamp around a cable of unknown diameter at an unknown depth in an unknown location. It needed to record multiple channels of communication simultaneously without any physical splice into the wire. It needed to operate unattended on the ocean floor for weeks, possibly months, in near-freezing water and crushing pressure. And it needed to be removable. A submarine crew had to be able to retrieve the recordings and leave the tap in place for the next collection cycle. The Bell Labs team built it anyway. What they produced was a cylinder roughly 3 feet long, designed to wrap around the cable like a collar. Inside sat induction coils, sensitive enough to pick up the faint electromagnetic field bleeding off the communication line. Multiple recording heads captured different channels simultaneously. The whole assembly was hardened against pressure, corrosion, salt intrusion, and prolonged submersion. Power came from an internal battery system. No external source, no connection to the cable's own current, nothing that would register as a load change on Soviet monitoring equipment. The power isolation mattered enormously. If the tap drew even a tiny amount of power from the cable itself, Soviet technicians running routine line checks would see the voltage drop and know something was wrong. How do you test a device like this when you can't tell anyone what it's for? Bell Labs had access to undersea cable technology because AT&T operated transatlantic telephone cables. The engineers could work with similar hardware in controlled conditions. But the gap between laboratory conditions and the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk was vast. Water temperature, cable composition, sediment interference, the specific signal characteristics of Soviet military communications, all unknowns that couldn't be resolved until the device was actually sitting on the target. The recording mechanism used large-capacity tape systems. When full, divers would physically swap the recording pods during subsequent submarine visits, leaving the induction collar permanently attached. Each retrieval mission meant another transit through the Kuril Straits, another approach to the cable site, another lockout dive in water cold enough to kill an unprotected man in minutes. One detail from the engineering files stands out. The device incorporated a self-destruct mechanism. If someone attempted to open or move the tap improperly, it would destroy the recordings and critical components. The Soviets could find the wreckage, but they wouldn't be able to reverse engineer what it had captured or how. The engineers at Bell Labs were building for two scenarios simultaneously: success and failure. October 1971, the USS Halibut, a converted guided missile submarine redesignated for deep ocean operations, slipped through the Kuril Straits running slower than a man walks. Her crew had been told they were conducting oceanographic research. Most of them knew that was a lie. Halibut was old, loud by American standards, and physically modified in ways that made no sense for a research vessel. A massive well chamber had been cut into her hull, originally designed to house a Regulus cruise missile, now repurposed as a diver lockout compartment and equipment bay. The Bell Labs device sat inside that chamber, along with a remotely operated camera sled the crew called the Fish. Halibut's commanding officer, Commander John McNish, had the coordinates, the mission parameters, and the knowledge that if anything went wrong inside Soviet territorial waters, there would be no rescue. The Navy would deny the boat existed. His crew would simply disappear. The transit through the Kurils took days. Halibut crept along the ocean floor, her sonar operators listening for the distinctive acoustic signatures of Soviet patrol ships overhead. The straits were shallow enough in places that a submarine running submerged had almost no margin between the seafloor and the surface. Soviet magnetic anomaly detection aircraft flew regular patterns above, and the depth compression meant Halibut's own noise bounced off the bottom and the surface simultaneously. Every mechanical sound amplified. A dropped wrench could theoretically register on passive sonar arrays. Once inside Okhotsk, McNish faced a search problem. The cable's approximate route was known from intelligence analysis, but the ocean floor doesn't come with street signs. Halibut deployed the Fish, a towed camera platform that could scan the seabed while the submarine moved at minimal speed. The crew watched grainy black and white monitors for hours, looking for a line in the mud. Days passed. The cable didn't appear. Food and air recycling capacity set hard limits on how long Halibut could stay on station, and McNish was burning through both. Then a junior operator spotted it. A straight-line depression in the sediment, too regular to be natural, running roughly northeast. The after-action documentation describes the moment in flat, bureaucratic language. Cable located, position confirmed. Preparation for diver operations commenced. The flatness of that language is almost offensive given what happened next. Divers locked out of Halibut's chamber into water barely above freezing. They wore saturation diving gear that kept them alive but not comfortable. The cold at that depth penetrates everything, settles into the joints, and slows fine motor function until even simple tasks take twice as long. These men had to locate the cable by touch in near-zero visibility, position the Bell Labs device precisely around it, confirm the induction coils were reading signal, and return to the submarine. All while Halibut sat motionless on the bottom of a sea the Soviet Navy considered its private lake. The tap recorded signal on the first attempt, multiple channels of Soviet Pacific Fleet communications. Unencrypted, because why would you encrypt a hardline cable under your own ocean, began spooling onto magnetic tape inside the device. The intelligence assessment later used the phrase staggeringly productive. McNish pulled Halibut off the bottom, retraced the route through the Kurils, and brought the first recordings back to Pearl Harbor. The tapes went to Fort Meade by armed courier within hours of docking. What the analysts heard on those tapes changed American understanding of Soviet naval capability overnight. What was on those tapes? The analysts at Fort Meade expected fragments. Partial conversations, garbled transmissions, maybe enough technical data to fill in gaps in existing intelligence estimates. What they got instead was the Soviet Pacific Fleet talking to itself with the casual openness of men who believed absolutely no one was listening. Fleet commanders discussed submarine patrol schedules by hull number. Maintenance officers complained about reactor problems on specific boats, while logistics personnel argued over torpedo allocations, and supply officers haggled over spare parts. One recording captured a flag officer berating a subordinate about delays in a ballistic missile submarine refit, naming the boat, the shipyard, the expected completion date, the weapons loadout. The lack of encryption was the key to everything. Soviet military doctrine treated hardline cable communication as inherently secure. Radio transmissions got encrypted because radio signals travel through open air where anyone with the right antenna can intercept them. But a cable bolted to the ocean floor inside Soviet territorial waters, monitored at both ends by Soviet naval personnel, protected by geography and an entire fleet? The communication security protocols simply didn't apply. Officers spoke in plain Russian, They used real unit designations and real names, actual operational details with nothing sanitized. The NSA transcribers at Fort Meade couldn't process the material fast enough. How much intelligence are we talking about? The exact volume remains classified, but Sherry Sontag and Christopher Drew's account in Blind Man's Bluff, still the most detailed public source, on Ivy Bells, indicates that each tape pod recovery delivered weeks of continuous multi-channel recordings. The take was so large that the NSA created a dedicated analytical cell just to handle Okhotsk material, separate from their existing Soviet Naval Intelligence Section, walled off even from other NSA programs. The compartmentalization tells you something about how seriously they valued it, and the content kept getting more valuable. Early tapes captured routine fleet administration. By the second and third collection cycles, as Halibut and later the USS Parche made repeated trips to swap recording pods, the analysts began building something unprecedented, a real-time operational picture of Soviet submarine movements across the entire Pacific theater. They knew which boats were deploying, when, to where, and in what condition, which captains the Soviet Navy trusted with the newest vessels, and which ones got stuck commanding aging diesel boats on coastal patrol. Readiness fluctuations became trackable. Maintenance backlogs rippling through the fleet showed up months before the operational consequences became visible on satellite imagery. The nuclear weapons protocols were the crown jewel. Soviet officers discussed warhead storage procedures, arming sequences, communication chains for launch authority. This was material the United States had been trying to collect through every available means: human intelligence, signals intelligence, satellite reconnaissance, overhead imagery analysis, for 20 years. The cable tap delivered it in conversational Russian, officers talking shop the way American officers might discuss the same topics over coffee in a wardroom they assumed was private. One thing nags at me about the security failure on the Soviet side. The assumption that cable communication was invulnerable wasn't stupid. It was physically reasonable. Electromagnetic induction as an eavesdropping vector against undersea cables was so far outside conventional thinking that Soviet communication security manuals apparently didn't address it at all. The Americans didn't break a code or compromise a cipher. They exploited a gap in Soviet imagination. The Soviets couldn't defend against a technique they hadn't conceived of. The Halibut made multiple trips back to Okhotsk. Then the Parche took over, a newer, quieter Sturgeon-class attack submarine better suited to the mission profile. Each run followed the same punishing routine: thread the curls, find the cable, lock out divers, swap the pods, crawl back out. The crews rotated, but the danger didn't. Every transit carried the same binary outcome: either the Soviets detect you or they don't. For nearly a decade, they didn't. By 1974, the program had a name: Ivy Bells. The code name was randomly generated. No symbolic meaning, no clever acronym. But it stuck because the people running the operation needed a way to talk about it in classified settings without describing what it actually was. Even inside the NSA, even inside naval intelligence, the words Ivy Bells got you into a very small room with very few chairs. The Parche changed everything about the operational tempo. Where Halibut had been a converted relic held together by institutional stubbornness and duct tape, the crew's characterization, not mine, The Parche was purpose-built for this kind of work. Quieter, more maneuverable at low speeds. Her modifications included an upgraded diver lockout chamber, improved navigation systems for precise bottom sitting, and expanded storage for multiple recording pods. The Parche could stay on station longer, work faster, carry more intelligence home, and do it all with a smaller operational footprint. She made her first Okhotsk run in the mid-1970s, and the improvement in collection volume was immediate. But the real expansion wasn't about one submarine getting better at one cable. It was about replicating the concept across Soviet waters entirely. Intelligence analysts identified additional military communication cables in the Barents Sea, connecting Soviet Northern Fleet installations along the Kola Peninsula. The Northern Fleet operated the bulk of Soviet ballistic missile submarines, the boats that actually threatened the continental United States with nuclear annihilation. If Okhotsk had produced staggeringly productive intelligence from the Pacific Fleet, what would the Northern Fleet cables yield? The answer required new tapping devices calibrated for different cable specifications, different water conditions, different operational environments. Bell Labs built them, and the Navy put them on the ocean floor. By the late 1970s, American submarines were conducting cable tapping operations in multiple Soviet naval theaters simultaneously. The Parche handled the Pacific. Other boats, their identities still partially classified, worked the Barents. The scope of what the United States was now collecting defies easy summary. Soviet nuclear submarine patrol patterns across both oceans, command authority structures for strategic weapons release, maintenance schedules that revealed which boats were combat-ready and which were floating paperweights, personnel assignments that let American intelligence track individual Soviet submarine commanders throughout their careers, building psychological profiles on the men who would control nuclear weapons in a crisis. The intelligence community had spent decades assembling this picture from scattered fragments. A defector's testimony here, a signals intercept there, a satellite photograph of a submarine pen, a naval attaché's cocktail party gossip. Ivy Bells handed them the complete conversation. The Soviets noticed nothing. Their cables carried American ears for years without a single alarm. The Defense Intelligence Agency's internal review called Ivy Bells the single most consequential human-placed collection asset in the history of undersea warfare. That phrasing matters. Not signals intelligence or technical collection. They called it a human-placed asset because without the divers, without the submarine crews threading Soviet choke points in absolute silence, the technology was just expensive metal sitting in a warehouse. So, what did a decade of undetected collection actually buy? Start with arms control. Throughout the late 1970s, American negotiators sat across from their Soviet counterparts at SALT II, talks with a staggering asymmetric advantage. They knew Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missile inventories down to individual warhead counts on individual boats. The American side also knew which figures the Soviet delegation was inflating and which ones they were quietly understating. When a Soviet negotiator claimed a specific number of operational ballistic missile submarines, the American side already had the maintenance records showing 4 of those boats hadn't left port in 18 months. The Soviets were negotiating against opponents who had read their cards before sitting down at the table. The crisis management applications ran deeper. During periods of heightened tension, and there were several between 1972 and 1981, American commanders could assess Soviet naval readiness in near real time by cross-referencing Ivy Bell's intelligence with satellite imagery and signals intercepts. A Soviet submarine surge that might look provocative from overhead photography could be matched against cable traffic showing. It was actually a scheduled training exercise delayed by reactor maintenance problems. Distinguishing between actual threat escalation and routine fleet activity during a crisis is worth more than any weapon system ever built. You cannot put a dollar figure on preventing a nuclear miscalculation. Fleet tactical doctrine shifted too. The Navy's submarine force used Ivy Bell's data to refine its tracking procedures for Soviet ballistic missile boats. Knowing patrol routes, transit corridors, communication windows, and preferred operating depths gave American attack submarines an almost unfair advantage in the cat-and-mouse game playing out beneath the Arctic ice and across the Pacific Basin. Soviet submarine captains followed patterns they didn't realize had been compromised. American boats positioned themselves along those patterns and waited. An irony sits buried in the operational security around IV Bells. The program was so tightly compartmented that most of the people benefiting from its intelligence didn't know where the intelligence came from. Fleet commanders receiving updated Soviet order of battle assessments saw finished intelligence products with source classifications they weren't cleared to question. The analysts who wrote those products worked in sealed facilities. The submarine crews who collected the raw material received no public recognition whatsoever. The Parche earned more presidential unit citations than any vessel in Navy history, 9 total, and for decades nobody outside the program could be told why. 9 presidential unit citations. The next closest submarine had 2. The silence held for almost 10 years. American submarines made dozens of collection runs into Soviet waters without a single compromise, detection, or failed mission. Intelligence kept flowing. The strategic advantage kept compounding. And then, in January of 1980, a 44-year-old NSA analyst named Ronald Pelton picked up a telephone and called the Soviet embassy in Washington. The phone he used was a payphone on a street corner in suburban Maryland. Pelton didn't use a dead drop, didn't arrange a clandestine meeting through intermediaries, didn't follow any of the tradecraft protocols that professional spies spend years learning. He looked up the number for the Soviet embassy in the Washington, D.C. phone book, walked to a payphone, dropped in a coin, and dialed. The FBI was already recording calls to that number. They caught his voice on tape but couldn't identify him. Not yet. Ronald William Pelton had worked at the NSA for 14 years, communications specialist. He held one of the highest security clearances available to a civilian intelligence employee, giving him access to compartmented programs across multiple collection disciplines. IV Bells was one of them. He knew the cable locations, the collection methodology, the submarine schedules, the scope of the intelligence take. He knew what the United States was hearing on those tapes and how that information was being used. By 1979, he also owed roughly $35,000 in personal debt. Credit cards, a failed real estate investment, the accumulated financial wreckage of a life that wasn't keeping pace with his clearance level. He filed for bankruptcy that year. The NSA noted the filing in his personnel record. Nobody pulled his access. That last detail still bothers me. The entire American counterintelligence apparatus understood by 1980 that financial distress was the single most reliable predictor of espionage vulnerability. Aldrich Ames, John Walker. The pattern was already established and already documented. An analyst with top compartment access to the most sensitive undersea collection program in existence files for bankruptcy, and the institutional response is a note in a folder. The security review process that should have flagged Pelton as a risk simply didn't function. Whether that was bureaucratic inertia or something worse, the records don't clarify. Pelton walked into the Soviet embassy on January 14, 1980. He met with KGB officers and offered to sell what he knew. The Soviets were skeptical at first. Walk-in volunteers were often provocations, dangles sent by American counterintelligence to feed disinformation. But Pelton's knowledge was too specific and too operationally current to be fabricated. He described the cable tapping program in the Sea of Okhotsk and the recording devices. He laid out how American submarines access the site and how frequently they return to swap collection pods. The KGB officers in that room understood immediately what they were hearing. The Soviets paid him $35,000. Some accounts say the total over multiple meetings reached closer to $44,000. For context, a new Chevrolet Camaro in 1980 cost about $7,000. Pelton sold the most productive intelligence operation of the Cold War for roughly the price of 5 mid-range American cars. What did the Soviets do with the information? The answer came in the winter of 1981, though the Americans didn't realize it immediately. A Soviet naval vessel, accounts vary on whether it was a surface ship or a submarine, conducted a targeted search of the Sea of Okhotsk seabed along the precise cable route that Pelton had identified. They found the tap. The recording device, a massive cylindrical pod roughly 3 feet in diameter and 20 feet long, was sitting on the ocean floor exactly where Pelton said it would be. Soviet divers recovered it intact. The intelligence loss was total. The NSA didn't learn about the compromise through counterintelligence work. They learned about it because the intelligence stopped. Collection runs to the Okhotsk site found the device gone. The cable was still there. The tap was not. Something had changed, and the list of possible explanations was very short. Either the Soviets had stumbled onto the device through extraordinary bad luck, or someone had told them where to look. Vitaly Yurchenko, a senior KGB officer who defected to the United States in 1985, provided the answer. During debriefings, he described a former NSA employee who had sold information about an undersea surveillance program. The FBI matched Yurchenko's description against the unidentified voice on that 1980 phone call to the Soviet embassy. Voice analysis confirmed it. Pelton was arrested on November 24, 1985. He was convicted of espionage the following June and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms. Soviet divers were already in the water when the salvage vessel settled over the coordinates, 47 degrees north, 153 degrees east, give or take whatever rounding the KGB applied to Pelton's information. The depth was around 400 feet, cold enough at the surface to kill an unprotected swimmer in minutes. At the bottom, the Sea of Okhotsk in winter sits just above freezing, a blackness so complete that handheld lights cut maybe 15 feet before the particulate swallows them whole. They found it almost immediately. The pod was exactly where Pelton said it would be. 20 feet long, roughly 3 feet across, clamped to the cable like some deep-sea parasite that had been feeding for years. Which, in a sense, it had. The Soviet divers would have seen the induction coils wrapped around the cable housing, the sealed recording compartments, the battery systems, the entire self-contained listening station that Bell Labs had engineered to survive years of unattended operation on a hostile seabed. The device bore no markings, no serial numbers visible from the exterior, no flags, no insignia, nothing that formally identified it as American property. The engineers who built it had planned for this possibility, the possibility of capture, and had stripped every external identifier. But the technology itself was identification enough. Nobody else on Earth was building equipment like this in the 1970s. The Soviets didn't need a label to know whose hands had placed it there. Recovery took time. The pod weighed several thousand pounds, and extracting it without damaging the cable required the same kind of careful rigging work that American divers had performed when installing it. The Soviets brought it to the surface intact. Intelligence officers were waiting on the deck of the salvage vessel. Photographs were taken. The pod was transported to a secure facility. Most sources point to a naval intelligence installation near Vladivostok, though some accounts suggest Moscow. What happened inside those sealed recording compartments mattered enormously. If the Soviets could access the stored intercepts, they would know precisely what the Americans had been listening to. Every conversation, every fleet order, every readiness report, every discussion of weapons systems and patrol routes that had passed through that cable while the tap was active. The compromise wasn't just that the Americans had been listening. The compromise was that the Soviets could now reconstruct exactly what the Americans had learned. The recovered pod sits today in the Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow. A display case. Explanatory placard. Soviet schoolchildren walk past it on field trips. The United States government has never officially confirmed that the device is American, that Ivy Bells existed as described, or that American submarines operated inside Soviet territorial waters to conduct cable tapping operations. The pod sits in a glass case in Moscow, and Washington says nothing about it. 3 consecutive life terms bought that silence back. The operation itself cost about $35,000 to destroy. The tape was a standard bureau reel. quarter-inch magnetic, the kind the FBI used by the thousands for surveillance recordings throughout the 1970s and 80s. Somewhere on that reel was a male voice, American, calling the Soviet embassy on a date consistent with early 1980. The voice had no name attached to it, no face, no file. Just a man offering to sell secrets to an enemy that was very interested in buying. The FBI's counterintelligence division knew what had been lost. The NSA told them that much. A submarine-based collection program of extraordinary sensitivity had been compromised, the collection device physically removed from the seabed, and the number of people with enough knowledge to betray the operation was finite. Finite, but not small. Ivy Bells touched multiple agencies across multiple years. Submarine crews, intelligence analysts, program managers, support staff, the Bell Labs engineers, Navy Special Operations divers, courier personnel. The access list ran into the hundreds. Narrowing that to a single traitor required either a breakthrough or a confession, and neither appeared forthcoming. 5 years passed. 5 years of dead-end leads, polygraph sweeps that caught nobody, and an investigation that the Bureau's own internal assessments later described as understaffed. The Counterintelligence Division was simultaneously chasing the Walker spy ring, which had compromised Navy communications on a scale that dwarfed anything a single analyst could have sold. Resources went where the visible damage was worst. Ivy Bells was a known loss with an unknown source, and cases like that sink to the bottom of the pile. Then Vitaly Yurchenko walked into the American embassy in Rome on August 1, 1985. KGB colonel. 5th Directorate, then reassigned to the 1st Chief Directorate's department responsible for operations in North America. He was the highest-ranking KGB officer to defect since the early 1960s, and in his first 72 hours of debriefing, he identified 2 active Soviet moles inside the American intelligence community. The first was Edward Lee Howard, a CIA officer who had sold information about Moscow station operations. The second was a former NSA employee, Yurchenko didn't have the full name, who had provided details about an undersea surveillance program targeting Soviet military communications in the Pacific. The description matched the voice on the tape. FBI agents pulled Pelton's personnel file. 14 years at the NSA communications specialist with compartmented access to Ivy Bells. Bankruptcy filing in 1979. Resignation in 1980, shortly after the phone call to the Soviet embassy. The timeline locked together cleanly. Voice analysis on the embassy surveillance tape confirmed the match. Pelton's speech patterns, cadence, regional accent markers, all consistent. They arrested him at his home in Annapolis, Maryland. November 24, 1985, a Sunday. He didn't run, didn't destroy documents. The FBI found no spy paraphernalia in the house, no coded communications equipment, no secondary dead drops. Pelton had operated with almost no tradecraft from beginning to end. A phone call, a walk-in, a handshake, an envelope of cash. The entire espionage career of the man who destroyed Ivy Bells fit inside a few afternoons. His trial the following summer lasted 2 weeks. The government faced an unusual problem, proving espionage without revealing the classified details of what had been compromised. Attorney General Edwin Meese had already inadvertently confirmed the program's existence during a press conference, which complicated the prosecution's attempts to keep specifics sealed. The jury convicted Pelton on all counts on June 5, 1986. The Barents Sea. Darker than Okhotsk, colder in the deep layers patrolled by the Soviet Northern Fleet, the larger and more paranoid half of Moscow's submarine force. The USS Parche was already there. What most accounts of Ivy Bells get wrong is the ending. They treat Pelton's betrayal as the final chapter. The program died, the Soviets won this round, lessons were learned, the books were closed. Clean narrative. Except the Parche didn't come home, she stayed out. The Navy had been running cable tap operations on multiple Soviet communication lines simultaneously, and the Okhotsk site, the one Pelton compromised, was only one node in a collection network that stretched across the northern Pacific and into the Atlantic approaches. The Soviets recovered one pod. They didn't recover the others because they didn't know the others existed. Pelton could only sell what he knew. His access was broad but not infinite. Compartmentalization, the same bureaucratic segmentation that failed to flag his bankruptcy as a security risk, actually protected the operations he hadn't been briefed on. The newer TAPs used updated technology, different cable routes, different submarine access procedures. The Parche had been modified specifically for extended special operations missions. Her hull lengthened by roughly 100 feet to accommodate a mission compartment that the Navy has never publicly described. She earned the Presidential Unit Citation and kept earning it. The Parche received more unit citations than any vessel in the history of the United States Navy. 9 total over her career. The citations are unclassified. The reasons for them remain classified. So what was she doing out there for all those years after Ivy Bell's supposedly ended? Silence from the Navy. Silence from the crew. The operational records sit inside a classification compartment that has survived every declassification review since the Cold War ended. Crew members who served aboard the Parche during the 1980s and 90s have said almost nothing publicly. A few have confirmed the submarine conducted missions of extreme sensitivity in hostile waters. The specifics stay locked. One detail from a declassified fitness report for a Parche officer references sustained operations at unprecedented proximity to Soviet naval installations. The word proximity does a lot of work in that sentence. The Parche was decommissioned on October 19, 2004 at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington. Her crew stood on the pier in dress uniforms. The citation record was read aloud. The missions behind those citations were not. Why did it work for so long? The Soviet Navy operated the largest submarine fleet on Earth. Their intelligence services were among the most aggressive in history. They maintained dedicated anti-submarine warfare networks across every ocean, monitored their own territorial waters with hydrophone arrays and patrol aircraft, and treated the Sea of Okhotsk as a strategic bastion, a protected zone where their ballistic missile submarines could operate under layers of defense. And for nearly a decade, American submarines drove into that bastion, parked on the seafloor, physically handled Soviet military infrastructure, and left without detection. The Soviets never found a single transit. They never flagged an anomalous sonar contact that led to investigation of the cable sites, never noticed that their most sensitive fleet communications were being recorded by a device clamped to their own hardware. The reason is institutional. The technology mattered. Bell Labs built something extraordinary. But technology alone doesn't explain a decade of successful penetrations. The submarine crews explain it. So do the divers and the intelligence analysts who knew exactly which cables to target and exactly when the collection windows would yield maximum value. Ivy Bell's worked because the entire American undersea warfare enterprise, from the shipyards to the signals intelligence desks, operated at a level of integrated precision that the Soviet system could not match. Moscow had brilliant engineers and brave submariners. They did not have the institutional connective tissue that turned capability into operational results. Pelton sold the coordinates for $35,000. The Soviets pulled one pod from the seafloor. The Americans kept tapping cables in other oceans with other submarines using better equipment. The net intelligence loss was significant but recoverable. The net intelligence gain over the program's full lifespan was not something $35,000 could undo. The modern submarine force still conducts special operations. The USS Jimmy Carter, commissioned in 2005, carries a multi-mission platform that defense analysts describe as the successor to the Parche's capability. Her missions are classified at a level that makes Ivy Bell's documentation look practically public. The operational concept, putting American technology where the enemy doesn't expect it, maintaining it without detection, then extracting intelligence that changes strategic calculations, did not end when the Cold War did. Ronald Pelton was released from federal prison on November 24, 2015, exactly 30 years after his arrest. He was 74 years old. The terms of his release have not been made public. The Ivy Bell's program files remain classified under their original compartment designation. Partial details have emerged through the Pelton trial record, the Yurchenko debriefings, and Sherry Sontag's 1998 book Blind Man's Bluff, which drew on interviews with retired participants. The core operational archive, mission logs, collection summaries, technical specifications, crew debriefs, sits inside a secure compartmented information facility at the National Security Agency. File series designation redacted. Access restricted to personnel holding the original program. Indoctrination. A retired Halibut crew member asked years later what it felt like to sit on the ocean floor inside Soviet territorial waters, said he could hear the cable humming through the hull.